Hi, welcome to GATS 5063, Models of Church Planning. This is week number 6, launching the church plant. So this is an exciting time for the church planter. It can be a little bit intimidating. There's a lot of work to do for the church planter, the church planning team, if you're working with the team to get ready for that church launch, but it can be very, very exciting. Remember, when it comes to the launch or the start of your first public meeting, that's really what we're referring to when we're saying, launch the church plant. What we're really saying is, going public, having your first public meeting. Maybe you've been meeting in the homes for a while, maybe even for several months or longer, building up the team. We'll get into that more in a minute. There's some different approaches before you go public or launch the church. But in the North American context and in most cultures around the world, a church is really seen as legitimate when you begin to have a Sunday morning. So having that Sunday morning service, public service, attracts a lot of people, or has the potential to attract a lot of people, and it begins to sort of legitimize in the eyes of many that you're an actual church. That said, you don't want to rush into it too quick. We'll develop this more as we get into this today. But it's important. And so remember, people are looking for some core things. They're looking for, in a public church service, they're looking for some good worship. They're looking for a good sermon. They're looking for children's ministry. They're looking to see if you're well organized. Do you have it together, or is it just kind of flying by the seat of your pants kind of thing? For most folks, they want to, if they get invited to a new church plant, many are hesitant anyways, especially if they're a non-believer. But even people who've been involved in the church for years and solid, mature Christians, there's a lot of risk with a new church plant. So when they come in, for that first meeting, it's very, very important that you've done your homework, you've done all the work that's necessary, and you're really ready to get going, because you may only have one shot with some of those people as to whether they give you a second chance or not. And so launching the church plant is a key piece of it. So before I get into some of my notes, I've got quite a few things I want to cover today. I want to look at chapter 13 from Stetzer Im's book, Developing a Launch Team. He gets right into, on page 155 here, you've got a couple questions this week from this chapter, question 28 and 29. And out of all the reading, I want to focus just on this chapter. The other reading is good, but it's pretty self-explanatory, and some of the notes I have I think will be helpful for you. He says this, he says, recruiting a launch team is challenging but essential. But then he goes on down to sort of allude to that a launch team may not be essential. Well, let's first talk about what a launch team is. Really, a launch team is those core group of people that you've been working with to start your church plant. And he suggests using the term launch team. I know that's become a more popular term in church planning circles, versus core team, so that if people within 6 months or so of the new launch or the start of the public meetings, they're getting tired or maybe near burnout and they need to transition or someone else take their place, there's not any negative connotation with them stepping down from the team. So he sees launch team, or that term, being a little more amenable to somebody transitioning, whereas if they're on a core team and all of a sudden they step down, now it's sort of like, oh, you've left the core team, So he makes an interesting point there, not letting people feel betrayed. He goes on to say, to answer his question, answer the question, is a launch team essential? He says, not all church plants need a launch team, and I would agree with that. He says, organic, simple, and missional incarnational approaches may not have a grand opening or launch approach, but most church planters do. So he says, it's worth our time considering. So, in other words, what he's saying is, especially if you're on a foreign mission field or working amongst indigenous peoples, there's not a lot of fanfare sometimes. You feel the calling of the Lord, the leading of the Holy Spirit. Maybe it's a husband and wife team. Maybe you've got a couple of other team members, or your missions organization has sent you out. And so you feel strongly led to plant a church, in XYZ area to reach XYZ people. All the things we've talked about these last few weeks in terms of, identifying your target group, demographic, etc. And so now you've gone in there. Well, you may just start by simply going into the marketplace and evangelizing and meeting some people, and maybe you win some folks to Christ, and maybe you start a home group in your home, and that's sort of how the church begins. And I seem to remember Paul going into Philippi and beginning to share in the marketplace with some folks. The next thing you know, a church is planted there in Philippi. So it doesn't have to have a lot of fanfare. The biggest thing is, what is the Holy Spirit? How is the Holy Spirit leading you? Now, that said, I think there is some practical things that you can glean from this, especially in a more, if you're a more developed nation or developed culture. There is a higher level of expectation that people have in terms of church services, worship services, etc. So the more organized that you are, again, maybe you got some good marketing materials pulled together, advertising, you've got teams organized, pulled together, new member curriculum developed, all these kind of things. It probably is beneficial to have a little more organization. And again, in some of these cultural settings, I know here in North America, that's probably definitely true. So you can read through this. I'll jump right to the end of the chapter. You've got a question 29, there on page 162. He says, Daniel and I will conclude with 5 final considerations of developing a launch team. Healthy launch teams are mission critical when seeking to start a church plant. Again, so he's going from the basis, or the premise that it probably is good to have a launch team. He mentions another book, Planning Fast-Growing Churches, author Stephen Gray. He identified 21 differences between fast-growing churches and struggling ones. Among these was the importance of healthy launch teams. Gray found that 88% of fast-growing churches had a launch team in place before launch, compared with only 12% of struggling churches. I thought that was a very interesting statistic. Again, I think in a North American culture, especially, or a more developed nation, cultural background, I think that probably does help. In other words, the more organized you are, the more organized the team is, the probably greater success you have that once you go public, you're going to be able to maintain some of the momentum from those first few meetings. He mentions number 2, church planning is a team sport. In other words, you want to have, build relationships as quickly as you can, get other people. Of course, he doesn't mention fivefold ministry. We've talked about some of that now, and I had you do the Destiny Finder back in week 2. Again, so the more that we can blend Ephesians 4:11, the different fivefold ministry gifts, the more effective I think your church plant is going to be, or the launch. He goes on to mention number 3, the relational missional network of the launch team helps shoulder the launch pre-launch task. In other words, the more that you have a team working together and some are helping you shoulder some administrative tasks, that helps. Number 4, I don't quite understand. I understand what he's saying, but I don't understand his how he titled this. He says, a launch team of believers is not always a good thing. I'm like, is he mentioning he wants unbelievers? That's kind of an interesting thing. But what he's talking about, in essence, is the planter needs to provide the visionary leadership, and those that are helping him need to be willing to follow that leadership. And we've talked about that before. And so he's referencing that sort of in terms of a partner church helping out type of thing. So I don't want to spend much time there. But again, these are some things that might be helpful for you. Number 5, new church launch teams experience fallout. And that's something that, I mentioned back in one of the earlier videos, might have been video number 1, how when the Lord really spoke to me and I finally said, yes, I'd plant the church here. And then he had me talk to a retired vineyard pastor, and he, I said, well, the Lord wants me to talk to you. And he goes, okay. And I said, well, I feel like he's leading me to plant the church. he looked at me and goes, well, I'm sorry, you'll lose the first 100 people that you gather. And of course, that was a shocking statement, but I found that to be pretty much true. In other words, a lot of people come and go in the early days of a church plant. And so, a core team, launch team, however you want to phrase it, your leaders, you need to prepare everybody. Once we start, we're going to get some traction. We're going to gain some people. We're going to lose some people. Even some of you may transition. And so you just need to be emotionally and spiritually prepared for that dynamic. So some good insights there, chapter 13 with Stetzer M. This week. So I'll put that aside. And all right, so let's talk about some other thoughts here. I'm going to look at two different models for launching your first public service. One is called an inside-out approach, and the other is an outside-in approach. And basically, the difference is this. An inside-out approach is you're going to start by meeting in a home, developing some leaders, maybe starting some other home groups. You get 40, 50, or maybe 70, 80 people, whatever number you and your leaders feel comfortable or you feel led of the Lord. So you've got sort of a base of people that you've been working with for a while, developing some leaders, these types of things before you go public. So that's one approach, the inside-out approach. The outside-in approach is you've worked with a few people, you've developed a core team or a launch team, if you want to use that term, and maybe you've only got 10 or so people, maybe you only got a half a dozen leaders, but you choose, rather than just start having home meetings and trying to build a church that way, you very quickly, when you feel ready, you go public. So even though you only have a few people, the goal is you're trying to gather people through evangelism efforts, word of mouth, advertising, etc., about the new church plant. You're well organized. You're ready to go after it. And so the gathering is going to happen after they start coming on Sunday mornings. Now, as you get more established, you begin to develop home groups, etc. So those are the two approaches I'm going to look at. There's some pros and cons with both. And so I want to kind of get into this. And some of this I learned through the Vineyard Association of Churches. Again, we were never a Vineyard church, but I had relationships with different Vineyard pastors. And of course, as you know, Randy Clark, American Baptist pastor, then became a Vineyard pastor and was a Vineyard pastor for a number of years before he started Global Awakening and transitioned in that way. There's a lot that we've gleaned from the Vineyard, some very good things. And so there was a time with the Vineyard, I don't know so much now, but there was a time with the Vineyard that they had one of the more effective church planning models. So I'm going to share some insights that I gleaned from them, and I think that will be helpful for some of you. All right, so again, by going public, we're referring to that point where you move from informally meeting in someone's house, maybe your house as the leader, with a small group Bible study and worship and prayer, to now you're having some official service, which is most likely going to meet on Sunday morning. Doesn't have to be. You might do a Saturday night or a Sunday night or something like that. I will say this, though. My experience has been in North American culture, now it may be different elsewhere, that folks really don't consider that service, even if you're meeting on a Sunday night someplace, really a legitimate church until you have a Sunday morning service. There's just something in the psyche of North American culture in particular that Sunday morning service is what really sets you apart as being a legitimate church. So, and then with that, you've got, as I mentioned right at the beginning here, you've got worship, you've got good preaching, you've got good organizations in terms of some type of nursery or children's ministry, and so again, that's all part of that going public and how people view you as an authentic, legitimate church service. So to go public then, or to launch your church, again, some may do it in a home setting. However, I don't believe that most people are going to really see a church in a home setting where maybe you can only gather 20 or 25 people as really being a legitimate public worship service. That most folks are going to look at it as a small Bible study. A few folks are gathering, that type of thing. So again, I know there's different models, and in different cultural climates, it may necessitate meeting at home. For example, there are certain cultures around the world, and governments, and even because of persecution by other religious groups, that there may be no other way to meet but in home meetings or small, quiet, non-public meetings. I think of the church in China, for example, and so underground home meetings, small meeting formats are the only way that they can, and obviously that church has grown and prospered very well. So again, you have to consider, how is the Holy Spirit leading? How is the culture? And again, I'm speaking more from a more developed nation perspective, North American context in particular, where freedom of worship is there, and the cultural norm is that you'll have a Sunday morning service. All right, so and that said, in North America, it's sort of the understanding that as part of our culture is that one of the primary doorways into Christianity is to attend a Sunday morning worship service someplace. Now, we all know that it's one's faith in Christ, their personal relationship with Him, being born again, and that doesn't have to happen on a Sunday morning. But again, for most people, on how they view Christianity, it's going to a building someplace on Sunday morning where there's worship, there's others that are gathered. And so for many people, that is the doorway to them experiencing God or becoming followers of Christ. So we just have to recognize that. Again, we want to help train the people to understand that the kingdom of God is much greater than just a Sunday morning service or just a building on the corner of Elm and First Street. It's much greater than that, and all of you understand that. So the bottom line is, you've got to give it a lot of thought, a lot of organization. Again, whether it's just you and your wife, or you and a couple people, or you and 10 other people in terms of a core team, you've got to really be in unity, know the Holy Spirit's leading, be in agreement on the time of the going public. That's an important thing. So let's talk a little bit more about this inside-out approach. So again, what you want to do is you begin to reach a group of people. You begin to work with a group of leaders. Now again, you may be sent out. If you've sent out, I give the example of my friend Alan Hawkins up in Albuquerque. He was sent out by a church with about 300 people. So obviously they bypassed the inside-out approach and went to the outside-in approach. In other words, they could start a Sunday service right away with a large group of people. Now, you may be sent out by a mother church, but maybe they're only able to send 10 or 20 people with you. So then you've got to prayerfully consider whether or not you want to go to a public meeting right away, or spend some time developing those people who will now develop some other people and start some home groups and let those grow a little bit. Maybe you get to 50 people, maybe you get to 80 people. Then you do your public service, first public service, or launch the church officially. And so again, there's pros and cons on this. I know that some of the vineyard leaders that I've talked to back at the height of the vineyard movement, the rationale was to have about 70, 80 people. If you could have about 7 or 8 home meetings with about 10 people in each group, with some solid leaders leading those groups, you were then probably ready to go ahead and start a Sunday service. And so that was sort of the rationale, and there was some good, it made a lot of sense in certain applications, because now you've got enough leaders that you've worked with who have relationships to help minister to some of the people. You've already got some home groups in place, some discipleship's already taking place. There's already a shared common value and vision, and so there's a real advantageous. And so now when you go to launch that first public meeting, you've got about 80 people or so, and so let's say another 50 people come, and you've got a solid leadership. You could be over 100 people now in a public service within the first couple of weeks, that are consistently coming. So there's a real advantage there. Especially another advantage is you as a church planner, if your gift mix is such that you're more relational, starting in the home setting and working with other leaders in that setting it can be a real advantage as well. Now, here's some disadvantages. Again, meeting in somebody's home or in some homes requires, for a lot of people that are being invited to a new church or a potential new church, it requires a lot of commitment on their part. And for a lot of people, they're just not ready. It's too intimate for them, especially maybe for some unbelievers, but even for some believers. It's just, if they're just not comfortable, hey, we're starting this new church and we're part of this, and would you want to come over? We got this great vision, etc. Well, you may get a few, but a lot of people are going to be a little more hesitant. So that's a big disadvantage, is trying to attract coworkers or people you're going to school with or neighbors or whatever, to small home groups that are part of a not yet established public church. And so there can be a real disadvantage there. Again, as I've said already several times now in this teaching, for a lot of people, they just don't consider church meeting in the home as being something as legitimate yet. And so a lot of times folks will say, well, look, when you start having public meetings and you're a real church now, give me a call and, I'll stop by sometime, So, I can remember getting a little bit of that ourselves when we first got going on it, even with the public meeting. So again, that inside-out approach, I think, in certain applications is very appropriate. You just have to really pray and just get the Lord's leading on what you think is the best way to do it. Remember, if you are going to use the inside-out approach, here's some things to think about. Your task is to multiply small groups through gatherings. So you can do a lot of recruiting, you can do a lot of training of those leaders, and you're going to be gathering people. So you're going to need to have lots of parties, picnics. You have to be really relational and really like the social aspect of it. Okay. Now, again, as I said, as soon as you've had enough people for two small groups to be meeting, it should be as few as 15 or 20 people. You need to pick some type of non-Sunday morning time, pull everyone together once or twice a month. So that's another approach. And you got enough people that you can get a once or twice a month type of meeting that maybe not yet public, but yet you're sharing the vision with them, you're doing some worship, you're just waiting in the presence of the Lord, prayer, and you kind of paving the way for when you're going public. So those are some things to think about. All right. Generally, for the inside-out approach, the goal should be, if you take that approach, to within 12 months you're going to go public. If it's sooner, great. But you need to have, again, at least 40, 50 people if you're going to use that type of approach. More is even better, 70. But you don't want to do it too long. If you do it too long, more than, let's say, 12 months, you're just not going to have the momentum with those that are already involved and really working to help you grow this and leading in different home groups and things. You're just not going to have the momentum. So you need to really be thinking in terms of probably about 12 months. Again, as we've said throughout this course, follow the leading of the Holy Spirit, be in agreement with your spouse, your team, and how the Lord's leading. All right, let's talk about the outside-in approach, which is basically what Carolyn and I did here about 17 years ago when we planted Passion Church here in Tucson. So with this, you start with a core of 10 or so people, but rather than trying to gather your first 50 people or so before you go public, you're going to use your public meeting to hopefully gather 50 people. And maybe more than that if God's grace is on what you're doing. So the advantage of that approach is that you're not spending a long time meeting, or one of the advantages, in the home groups trying to build traction. So you're kind of bypassing some of the, hey, let's have another party, let's have another barbecue approach. Again, not that those things are not helpful and good. We still do some of that with our leaders and things. But what you're doing is you worked with some core leaders for a while. You've got a common vision. You've worked on your church plant proposal. You've got you're walking in a common agreement as to what your ministry practice and style is going to be. You've researched the target area, the demographic. You're ready to really start going public. And so now you've done your homework, and you by going public, you're going to be much better prepared, I think, to do well. Again, the drawback is you have fewer leaders that are part of the core, that quickly are going to have to do some of the work. I'll get into more disadvantages here in a second. So starting from the outside in is a quicker way of starting things. It takes the advantage of the fact that people are more inclined to come out to a meeting that's public, because now they see it as something as legitimate, that meets on Sunday morning, that has childcare. And so I would say right off the bat, whether you do the inside out approach or outside in, you've got to have a plan to have childcare from the first moment you're going to do that public meeting. And actually, even if you're doing some home meetings, you've got to be, well organized with the childcare. But that is a key point. You're not going to attract young families and with children if you don't have a well organized, safe, healthy childcare environment for them. Now, another advantage to this outside in approach is if you are a good speaker, good preacher, good teacher, and you do well in front of larger groups of people or crowds of people. You're a good vision caster. You're good at building a natural rapport with a large number of people as you're speaking. Then going public sooner is going to be more advantageous, because it will, that speaking gift will be attractive to a lot of folks. A lot of people, even in our network, the Global Awakening Network of churches, that are very much after the gifts of the Spirit, moving the gifts of the Spirit, healing, etc. Presence, presence of the Lord is a big thing. Extended worship in the presence. That's all very important and certainly a big part of our core values. That said, most people want good teaching, good preaching, good childcare, good facility. They want those things on Sunday morning. So you have to be cognizant of that. And if you are a naturally gifted speaker, then use that to your advantage. If you've got a great worship team, if you've already got a great worship team to pull together, and you got a good speaking gift, or you've got your team members that are good speakers as well, you might rotate, however that works. Then again, these are reasons to go public quicker. All right, let's talk about some disadvantages to going public quicker rather than waiting a little bit. Probably the biggest disadvantage is you try to pull your public service together too quickly. You just aren't organized enough. The team members aren't ready. You're just so excited to get this going. You feel the Lord's leading, and you're like just that thoroughbred that's ready to bust out of the gate. Well, you may start too quickly. Now remember, as I said right at the beginning, you've got one shot at going public. In other words, if you feel led of the Lord to do some significant advertising and whether it's social media, whether it's on a website, you probably, by the way, you should develop a good website first, I would recommend, before you go public. Again, I'm speaking in a North American cultural context in particular, European. In more developing nations, maybe that's not as critical. That said, with the proliferation of the internet and web pages, the more information about you as a church and what you're going to do, what your mission, what your vision statement is, what your mission statement is, etc. Statement of beliefs, all those kind of things. You pull that together on your website when you're first, where you're going to meet, what the location is, all of those things. So if you take your time and you pull all that together first, and then do your church launch, you'll be much better. But if you launch too quickly, you only get one shot at it. And so if it doesn't go well, and you're unprepared, it's not like you can, reload and take another shot next week. You've already kind of had the big fanfare leading up to it, and so now you've got to get going. And even if you're well prepared, you need to be prepared for like the next 6 months of services, thinking about who's going to lead, what, as much as you can. Be as organized as you can. Your leaders, sermons you're going to teach, the new members material. When are you going to start small groups? You get 20 or so people, you need to be thinking about small groups. And I'll touch on some of these things some more here in a minute. But all of these things are important. And so the biggest caution, the biggest disadvantage with starting with just a handful of core people and going public is that you go too quickly and you're not as organized as you need to be. Also, you need to understand that that small group of people, again, even if it's 10, that's not a lot of people for a public service, they're going to be doing a lot of work. So you really need to make sure that you have their buy-in, their agreement, and they're with you on this, and they're ready for that, 6-month, year-long commitment to really get this thing off and going. If you've got a sending church, that may be a little more helpful. They can help send teams and things. Again, I said this in an earlier video. I don't agree with trying to solicit worship team members from other churches. Unless you have a partner church that has verbally committed to you at the very beginning when you first start talking about a church plant. You don't want to be all of a sudden, hey, it's 2 weeks before we have our first public service, and we don't have enough worship team members, and now I got to go to First Baptist down the corner there and invite some of their folks, and you just don't want to do it that way. So you want to take your time, make sure you've got the right folks that you need to do the church launch the way you did. Now, you don't have to have a worship team to launch your church, to have your first public meeting. A lot of folks, as I shared before, they're doing YouTube video sets and things like that. I mean, you can do some different things. Again, I think if you can have a worship team and they're talented enough that can flow in some more of the contemporary worship, that's probably to your advantage. Is going to help legitimize your new church plant. But again, in some cases that's not possible. It wasn't possible for us, as I shared before. We took turns back then. We didn't have the YouTube worship videos and things. We took turns burning CDs with about 5, maybe 6 songs on them, and basically singing to the CDs, and that worked okay, especially when we were smaller. But once we got a certain size and we got our first piece of property and things, having that worship team was really critical to the next phase of it. So, all right, here's some other principles to remember for this outside-in approach, some of which I've already covered. Have a plan for how you're going to reach people and make initial contacts, and then have a plan for as well, what are you going to do once you reach them and now they're going to be part of your church. Secondly, have a fairly specific plan for the first 12 months, what events you're going to do, when, where, how you're going to attract people to them. One of the first things we did was I brought in a friend of ours, some of you may know him, Gary Oates, came in and we did a meeting, and it was just a few weeks into some of our first public meetings. Now, you don't want to have too many guest speakers because that may delegitimize your pastoral ability or your speaking ability. So you have to have a right balance. But bringing in some key speakers, maybe 2-3 times that first year, can really be a shot in the arm and build some momentum for attracting new people. Well, it turns out that we got some advertising out about having Gary come, and we rented a hotel conference room, and word got out. Gary was coming, and it just happens the local Christian radio station heard that he was coming, and somehow or another this local radio host heard of Gary, heard of some of the miracles that had happened. So down in Brazil, he was ministering down there. Long story short, there was a radio interview with my wife and I before Gary ever got here about what was happening, and so that built more momentum. Then they did a radio interview with Gary when he got in town, so that built more momentum. Well, we had, I think, 300 plus people in that conference room setting, and it had this packed out feel. And here we were, just a new church plant, and we were only 10 or so people that basically, started the church and moved from having a few home meetings here for a couple months in our house to getting ready to doing that church plant. So it added a lot of momentum right away, and I think we picked up some folks. Again, you're going to pick up some folks that are long-term mature believers that just are looking for the type of church that you're going to bring. So your goal isn't to pull people away from other churches or have church growth through church transfer. However, it does happen, and some of these folks just aren't going anywhere, and so that's just a reality of it. So we ended up, I think, growing by, maybe we doubled. We were about 20 or 25 people after, that folks that stuck with us. But that added some momentum. Again, as I've already said, you want to have a solid core to begin with. Whether you probably want to call them your core team, whether you want to call them your launch team or have certain ones that are just the launch, that's a different issue. I mean, I think core team or your leadership team is fine. Now, be careful. Now, I will say this: you want to be careful if you're telling them they're part of your leadership team. That's an even bigger deal. But really, they're just helping you plant the church. If they don't have the spiritual DNA to really be an elder type leader, and you're telling them they're part of the core team or leader team, that could be problematic. So in that sense, I do agree with Stetzer M. Maybe you do want to just call some of the folks till you really get to know them. You want to take your time before you put key leaders in place. Hey, we want to invite you to be part of the launch team. And so that's a little different dynamic. So I would mention that. Again, when people come to a new church and you start this public meeting, there is some caution, sometimes even fear, but mostly caution that people have. So you want to have lots of marketing materials, brochures, is more organized and done professionally, these type of materials that you can, like a vision statement card, a brochure about your church, who you are, what your core values are, where you meet, what service times, these type of things. Maybe some invite cards, business size cards that are invite cards, the name of the church, and on one side, and on the back side where you meet, service times, and that type of thing. So you can give to people, they can hand out to others, but people want to know who are you. So you need to have not only a vision statement and your name of your church, but you need to especially use or whoever the key church planter is or the key leader need to know some about you or some about the leadership team. They want to know what you believe, what are your statement of beliefs, or at least your core values. What's your background, what's your educational background, where do you come from? Are you related to anybody? You're part of a denomination? Are you part of a network of churches? Who's standing with you? So those are important things. So also, here's another key point. When it comes to Sunday morning, it's really doing double duty. It's not only a time of worship and teaching, for your church to gather new people, but you're also feeding the ones that you have. So you always have to remember that dynamic. And even those of you that are pastoring, you understand that dynamic. And Sunday morning is a different dynamic than other times that you might meet with your church or have services. You've got new people, that come in frequently. If you're a larger church, that's certainly going to happen. And so you've got those that are there, they want fed. And they've got one set of needs. You've got younger families, they've got another set of needs. You've got older folks, they've got another set of needs. But, certainly for your new people coming in. So you're trying to have certain things for them as well as you're feeding your people that are there, as well as your children's ministry, your youth ministry, etc. All of those things are very important. So as I've already said, by the time you get 20 or so people in your public gathering, you need to be thinking about, now again, this is the outside-in approach. You need to be thinking about developing small groups and having small groups. It's very important. And keep in mind that by the end of 6 months, certainly by a year, many that are part of that church launch team, they may be near burnout. So you have to be very sensitive to how much work everybody's doing. So while maybe having a couple of special guests is good, keep in mind it's a lot of extra work for your volunteers that are helping. And so you've got to weigh all of that. And again, family dynamic, you and your wife, or you and your husband, whatever the case may be. And your family, your children, all of those, how is the work-life balance doing? How are you doing? Are things, you're on the edge. It's sort of the nature of any type of pioneering work, whether it's pioneering missions work or pioneering church planting. You're a pioneer. You're kind of the tip of the spear, so to speak. And so there's pressure, there's extra work, there's spiritual warfare, all of those things. And so we don't want to, ignore it. And so, but we also don't want to just sweep it under the carpet. It's like, tell people, well, you just press on, just press harder, because there's a certain amount of that you want to coach and build up and encourage, those that are working with you. But you also have to be sensitive, in trying to read where everybody's at and how much to push, how much to back off. And so you just need to be aware of that. And you may not be able to do some of the things that you want to do right away. Like, for example, more evangelistic outreach, because you're so busy just doing all the administrative stuff, you and your team, and doing that Sunday morning service. Especially, let's say, if you're renting a school gymnasium or a hotel conference room and you're lugging equipment. I mean, that's what we did for 2 years. We were lugging equipment back and forth in our minivan, a couple of other leaders, stuff in their vehicles, and we were dropping it off at the hotel conference room and setting up every we were meeting on Sunday nights then, and it was a lot of work, to do all that. And by the way, just to segue too much, but I want to come back to some of these things. So after 6 months of meeting on Sunday nights publicly in a hotel conference room, we got permission on a vacant lot, which ironically is like half a mile from where our present church is now, church property is now, to meet on this vacant lot to do a Sunday morning service. There was a brother that owned the property. He was an older man, and there was a lady we ran into had a feeding program, ministering to the poor on that vacant lot. She had permission. And we got to talking to her. We had such a heart to minister to the poor as well. And she just said to my wife and I, she said, would you consider doing a Sunday morning service here? So we were already having Sunday night. So like, well, we prayed about it. We felt this was an opportunity. This was the Lord. So as it turned out, we already had the sound equipment. Everything was portable. As it turned out, we had the Lord open up an opportunity. We met another brother that it was an evangelist and had some tents. And he had a tent that was, I think it was a 20 by 20 tent. And we got this tent for like $800 up in New Mexico. We drove up there and got the tent. And we had enough raised in offerings and stuff we could go buy the tent. So we bought the tent, brought it back in our van. And someone donated, of all things, an old bread truck. And I don't even remember how that happened. It was, I think the same lady had the feeding program. She knew somebody, and they donated this old bread truck. So now we're loading the tent and chairs. We got chairs from someplace, loading them up, and pieces of carpet. Somebody went and got a bunch of carpet remnants and stuff. And so our core team, which was about 10 of us, were literally setting up a tent, rolling carpet out, setting chairs up, setting up sound equipment on Sunday morning in this dirt lot. We did it for 9 months, and the church grew. And we were still having our Sunday morning meetings. It was great, our Sunday night meetings in the hotel. And eventually we backed off on some of the Sunday night meetings. It was a really crazy time. Now here's the wild thing. So for those first few months, we're meeting on Sunday nights in the hotel room, which the conference room is very nice, air conditioned. I mean, you've been in conference rooms. And the church grew some, and the offerings were coming in. It was good. So here we are on the dirt lot, of homeless. We'd have folks show up. We had coffee and donuts, and then we got Dunkin' Donuts. They were donating donuts and stuff, and we were having that. People loved it. They said they're the coffee, and so we had a mixture of church folks and folks that were, in different places in life, and it was very interesting. At the end of the 9 months, we actually had put $10,000 in the church account, meeting on the dirt lot. God worked in a crazy way through that whole thing. I had some pastors in town later tell me, they go, when we heard you were doing they called it church in the dirt. Word got around. It was kind of funny. When we heard you were doing the Sunday services in that dirt lot with a tent, and knew that you were still had some meetings on Sunday nights, one pastor said, we joked, a couple of us, is like, well, it's either God or they're going to kill this new church plant. Well, it must have been God, because the church continued to grow, and we had money in the bank. And so that actually led the way to helping us get ready to purchase some of the church property we're in now. So again, you just have to really be led of the Lord. But I say all that to say, be cognizant of your team. And because they're working hard with you, and burnout is something that can creep up really fast, not only for you and your spouse perhaps, but for you and other team members. So just be cognizant of that, and don't try to build too quickly. But that said, if the Lord opens up and the Holy Spirit clearly shows you an opportunity, like something crazy like what we did, and it's the Lord, and you have peace and everybody's in agreement, then move on it, because you just don't know how the Lord can work through something like that. So, all right, so don't be too consumed with trying to build a lot of infrastructure at this juncture. You've just gone public. You're in your first few months or a year. You need to continually keep trying to get more organized and building more infrastructure and working with developing leaders. All of that. That's certainly good. But if you try to get too much structure too quickly, you could burn yourself out. So again, you just always trying to find that balance of training new leaders and getting more organized and doing things with more and more excellence. It's just a sort of an art, and trying to find that and just trust the Lord on that. Again, do some things that maybe create momentum. We talked about that, some special conferences or guest speakers coming in, but you got to be careful not to do it too much. Here's a big one. Always keep sharing the vision and clarifying the vision with the people, both those who have been with you a while and the new ones that are coming in. Share the vision. Share what God's put on your heart. Share what the mission is, what the goal is, what you're trying to do. And then evangelism is another piece of it. So again, you've got to have the right balance. Not, you can't be doing evangelism every weekend. Unless the Lord's clearly led you for a season to do that, or if you've got some that can focus on it. But you do need to do some evangelism, but you've got to keep it all in balance with what you're trying to do on that. And lastly, sort of related to this, shared this at the beginning, find ways to continually make your church more visible. Signage is important. If you're meeting in a school or conference, hotel conference room, or even the vacant lot like we did, we had signs, we put those A-frame signs up, is important, but your web page is such a huge deal. If you're not familiar with the web page development, find somebody that is, learn about SEO, search engine optimization, how to make your web page stand on the top. There are folks that will help you with that. There are certain keywords you want to use. Learn how to do social media, or find some folks that can help you do social media. All of those things come into play. YouTube works, Google bought out YouTube, so learn how to do YouTube and put YouTube on your YouTube videos on your website. Do it weekly. That will actually help your church website pop to the top quicker, that type of things. So in closing, here's 8 questions. Actually, I think I'm down to, I don't think it's 8. 8 questions to ask before going public. Obviously, what's the name of your church? Hopefully you've got that ironed out and you've already been thinking about that. But what's the name of your church? And again, you probably want to have your vision statement developed and your mission, if possible, your mission statement. You probably want to have your statement of beliefs developed. You want to get some type of brochures done up. Certainly you want to have some of that on your website. You want to have bio about you, your key leaders, etc. You need to have all that stuff in place. Secondly, what will your first 6 months of sermons be? Do you have an idea? You have a direction that you're going to go on? Think about that. Give that some thought, where you're going. You should think about a couple of guest speakers, but not too many. Like I said, maybe 2 or 3 that first year. What are you going to do about children? That is, again, I've stressed that several times now through this teaching. You really need to have a plan about children, how you're going to minister to children. You need to think about the facility, and especially as it relates to children. So you got to think about, if you're meeting in a hotel conference room, where are the children going to meet? Who's going to work with the children? You need to think about things like background checks. Those type of things right away. Who's going to be working with the children and that type of stuff. Next, do you have your basic introductory material for new people coming in? We call it Start Here guide. Newcomers material, that type of stuff. Written, printed, that type of stuff. Do you have a new members class or some type of avenue to assimilate new members and tell them more about you? Now, what we do presently, now of course we're 17 years into this, we actually do a luncheon. What we find has worked well, like every 6 weeks we do a luncheon, and we invite anybody that has not come to a new members luncheon to come. And usually, these luncheons are about 30 or so people with some of our leaders, and so it's manageable. You have 10 or 15 of our leaders there, and you might have 10 or 15 new people that have come in the last 6 weeks and they're checking you out. And so what we've done is we've actually, instead of doing like a big teaching, then we just kind of very informal introductory. We eat, pray, eat, very informal introductory. My wife and I will introduce some of the leaders. We just share for a moment, let the people maybe share a moment about how they found Passion Church, etc. But what we've done is we put like an hour-long teaching on a flash drive that we give them that also has a PDF that it has our, Welcome to Passion Church, guide. It's actually named something different, but we give that to everybody. So we said, listen, you can go home and rather than all of us do a long teaching and tell how we got started, what our vision is, etc., they've got it right there. So with flash drives now being as cheap as they are, it's like a 2 gigabyte flash drive. We can get a video on there, PDFs on there, and I think they're $1 or so or $1.50 for these flash drives, and so it's really relatively inexpensive once you get the video done to duplicate it and have that. So you want to have some kind of material. That's just a suggestion, way to get that to the people. Have you come up with your budget? Well, you should. If you've done some type of church plant proposal, you should have some idea, again, of some of these things I've already covered, in terms of your budget, where you're going to meet, so your plan for the first 12 months or 24 months, that type of thing. And so you need to, trying to get, with certain your core people, try to get as much commitment financially from them. It's a tricky thing. You never want people to feel pressured to give, but yet you're trying to get an idea of a budget, and if God shows you a strategy or a way that you can talk to everybody in a comfortable way, it can be a helpful thing. Personally, we never did that. We just, again, but part of the reason we never did was for that first year and a half of this new church, it was our extra income from the job that I was working that was covering all of the expenses of the church plant. Anything extra that came in, we just began to put into the church account. So in other words, it didn't take the pressure of us having to put pressure. You never want to do that. But you know what I'm saying. We're having to really have all these conversations about giving and things with even our core leaders. So they gave as they felt led, and then we just trusted God through the process, and it worked. So again, you just got to trust the Holy Spirit through it. Pray a lot. Pray, right? Church government, church board, oversight of finances. So these are something, again, in your church planning proposal, you probably want to think a little bit. Or if you're being sent out from another organization, maybe they're sort of the governing authority, or you're going to establish your own 501c3 church corporation if you live here in America. You need to think about all these things. You're going to be, become part of a network of churches, and maybe you're under their 501c3. How are you going to do the church government? Are you going to be elder driven, or are you going to have more of an apostolic church government, and you have some leaders that are gathering around, your vision, that type of thing? Do you have a separate church board? You need to give all that some careful thought, and how you're going to do that. There's different ways you want to go about that. Lastly, how are you going to let a lot of people know you are there and invite them to be part of your church? Again, it kind of goes back to the website, word of mouth, signage, everything you can do, evangelistic effort, getting invite cards out there. You might consider doing flyers. We never did that. We never did like a mail out to, in a local geographic area, and largely because we're not really a community church. We're a very specific type of church. We're a kingdom-minded, spirit-filled church that functions in the gifts of the Spirit. Worship is a big part of what we do. And so, it's folks looking for that type of church, and so they may not be right in the geographic radius. So just doing a mail out, we never felt would do the thing. That said, maybe the Lord leads you in that direction. So again, you just got to ask the Lord how you might want to do it. And certainly if you're overseas and you're planting churches, a lot of what you're going to do is more evangelistic and going out into the areas of the city if you're working more in a larger metropolitan area, or into the rural areas, and working, trying to reach the people, working with local people you've raised up that can really go out and invite people, evangelize, those type of things. So, all right, well, that's lesson 6 on how to launch your church or go public. I hope that was helpful. A lot of good material, both in the reading and I think some of the things I've shared today. I can't state this enough, whether you do the inside out approach or the outside in approach, before you go public, You need to really be prepared. That's the key thing, because you only have one shot at it, and once you start, once the horse is out of the gate there, you got to run the race, and you're in it for the long haul, you and your team. So you got to count the cost. You got to be ready for the work that's involved, organized, and trust the Lord's leading on it, and you'll do great. God bless.